Montana Territory, June 1880. The girl came out of the trees like a ghost, barefoot, bleeding, and carrying a boy no older than 4. Elijah Hart had just thrown a shovel of ash over the fire pit behind his cabin when he saw her. The sun was low, slanting gold behind the pines, and for a second, he thought his mind played tricks on him. But then she stumbled, knees buckling in the sagebrush, and the boy in her arms cried out. He dropped the shovel. "Hey!" he called, running toward her. "Miss, wait!" She flinched and turned like a cornered doe, eyes wild beneath a torn bonnet. "Do not touch me." "I will not," Elijah said, hands raised. "I swear it. Let me help the boy. He is hurt." She hesitated, just long enough for him to see the tremble in her arms. The boy was too heavy for her. She had carried him too far. Her dress was torn up the side and her feet were raw with blisters and blood. Elijah stepped closer, slow and careful. "I have water, a safe place. You can rest." The girl's chest rose and fell like she had been running for days. Then her knees gave out. Elijah caught the boy before he hit the ground. Inside the cabin, the air was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and pine soap. Elijah laid the boy, no broken bones, just a fever on the cot near the stone hearth. The girl leaned against the wall, panting, one hand pressed to her side where her ribs stuck out too sharp. Elijah poured water from the kettle and handed her the cup. "Start with this, then we will talk." She drank like someone who had not stopped to breathe in hours. "My name is Elijah Hart," he said. "This is my land. It is quiet. No one comes here without meaning to." The girl lowered the cup. Lena Sutton." He waited. She said nothing else. "Is he yours?" Elijah asked, nodding to the child. Her voice cracked. "My brother. His name is Henry." Elijah crouched beside the boy. "Fever's high, but he is breathing steady. I can ride for the doctor in town." "No," she said quickly. "Please. No one can know we are here." He looked at her then, really looked. Her face was streaked with dust, but her eyes were sharp. Not broken, just scared. "You running from someone?" Lena said nothing. "You got my word," Elijah said. "I do not ask questions you are not ready to answer." She stared at him, like she did not believe men like him existed. He gave her the bed and slept on the floor. That night, Henry coughed until his small chest heaved, but by morning the fever had broken. Elijah brought in stew and bread and a worn quilt from the trunk. Lena barely touched the food, but she did not let Henry out of her sight. 3 days passed. Henry grew stronger. Lena stayed quiet. It was the 4th morning when Elijah found her outside, chopping kindling with one of his axes. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I do not want to owe you." "You do not." She kept chopping. He watched her a moment, then said, "I lost my brother to the war. You do not have to talk. But I know what it means to carry someone else's pain." Lena stopped. She looked up, and there was something in her face, something heavy and held back for too long. "My father sold us," she said, "to a man in Kansas. He wanted to settle a debt, said we were not worth keeping. Henry and I ran. I do not know what kind of man Elijah Hart is, but I know I cannot go back." He stepped closer. "You are never going back there. Not while I have breath in my chest." Her eyes filled but did not spill. "You do not even know me. I know you carried that boy through the wilds of Montana without boots. I know you have not taken more than you need. That is enough." Lena blinked fast and turned away. That night, she sat by the fire after Henry fell asleep. Elijah poured her tea and handed it over without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing his. "You do not ask questions," she said. "I figure you will tell me what you want me to know." She looked into the fire. "You are kind. I am trying. She leaned back in the chair, her shoulders finally relaxing. It has been a long time since anyone tried. The next day, Elijah rode into town for supplies. When he returned, Lena was hanging wet clothes on the line and Henry was chasing a pine cone with a stick. It looked like a family scene, and something in Elijah's chest stirred. Over the following days, Elijah built Henry a small wooden horse and taught him to whittle. Lena began cooking again. One evening, she brought out a tin of her mother's sewing needles and mended Elijah's shirts without being asked. "I can earn our keep," she said. "You do not have to." "But I want to." Elijah smiled. "Then I will not stop you." Spring turned to early summer. The days grew warmer. Henry's cheeks rounded out. Lena's eyes softened. One night, they sat outside after supper, watching the stars come up over the pines. Elijah handed her a mug of coffee. She took it with a quiet smile. "I am not the same girl who ran through those trees," she said. "I know. You gave us more than shelter." He looked at her, slow and steady. "You gave me reason to open that door." She looked down, then back at him. "I am scared to let myself feel something again." "I will not hurt you, Lena." She reached for his hand. Her fingers were small but strong. "I believe you." Elijah leaned in, slow, waiting. She met him halfway. It was not rushed, not desperate, just two people who had lived through the dark, finally finding light in each other. They kissed under the stars. And when she leaned her forehead against his, she whispered, "You are my safe place now." Elijah held her hand tighter, and he knew, without a doubt, he would never let her go. The wind changed with the season, carrying the scent of wild rose and the far-off damp of summer storms. Elijah sat on the edge of the porch, oiling the hinges on the barn door latch while Lena brushed burrs from Henry's shirt with a piece of muslin. The boy had taken to roaming the edge of the pasture, chasing grasshoppers and learning the names of birds Elijah pointed out from time to time. "You always work with your hands?" Lena asked, nudging a boot against the railing as she sat down beside him. Sleeves rolled high, palms nicked from chores she never complained about. "Since I was big enough to hold a hammer," Elijah said. "My pa was a blacksmith. He didn't have much use for lazy fingers." She didn't smile, but her eyes traced the calluses along his knuckles. "You fix things." He looked up. "I try. I never learned that. I was taught to keep things tidy, not to mend what's broken." She glanced toward the field, where Henry crouched in the grass. "I think I'd have rather had a hammer in my hand than a thimble." "You still can," Elijah said, setting the oil can aside. "There's no rule says you can't learn now." Lena pulled her braid over her shoulder and twisted the end. "I wouldn't know where to start." "With whatever feels like yours," he said quietly. "A place, a tool, a piece of your own choosing." She looked at him like he'd set something down in front of her that no one had ever offered before. That evening, Elijah brought out a small box from the wagon shed, covered in dust and pine needles. "Found this tucked behind some planks last fall. Belonged to my mother." Inside were two carving knives, their handles worn smooth, and a spool of linen thread alongside a bundle of dried lavender. "She made toys when she could," he said. "Said it kept her hands from turning to stone." Lena touched the edge of the linen. "She sounds like someone I'd have liked." "She'd have liked you too. You both keep your sorrow quiet, but it's there, like a river under ice." She folded the linen in her lap. "I'm not used to being seen." "You don't hide well," he said. "Not from someone who's looked long enough." Later, as dusk fell, Henry curled against the hearth with his head on a folded blanket, and Lena sat on the floor beside him, sorting through the contents of the box. Elijah watched from across the room, not speaking, letting the silence stretch easy between them. "Did you love someone before?" she asked suddenly, voice low. Elijah rubbed a thumb across the back of his neck. Once, a long while ago, she married a banker out of Butte. Didn't want to wait on a man who lived with his hands in dirt and horses. Lena didn't answer right away. Then, I was promised to a man who smelled of whiskey and sweat. My father said he'd take me as part of the land deal. You didn't go. I couldn't. She shifted, picking at a loose thread in her skirt. I'd rather be chased through thorns and lose half my blood than be owned. Elijah's voice was steady. You're not anyone's to own. She nodded but didn't look up. By midsummer, the garden she'd cleared behind the cabin had taken root. Beans climbed trellises made from willow branches, and the cucumber vines sprawled low and thick. Lena spent her mornings there, hands sunk in soil, sleeves damp with dew. One morning, Elijah came up behind her carrying a crate of firewood. She turned, cheeks flushed from sun and effort. I always thought the ground hated me, she said. Nothing I touched ever stayed alive. Maybe the ground just needed someone to stay long enough. She blinked at him. Then, slowly, she stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. I want to build something here, not just borrow it. Elijah set the crate down and stepped closer. Then we'll build it together. She reached for his hand, not needing to be sure anymore. I'm not afraid of loving you, she said. Only of losing what we've found. You're not going to lose it, he said, his voice barely above the wind. You've already made it yours. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, careful, steady, as though the moment needed to be held just right. Inside, Henry stirred in his sleep, the sound of his dreaming soft against the cabin walls. And outside, beneath the open sky, two people stood at the edge of something they had never expected to find, a future not borrowed or begged for, but made with their own hands. Elijah tightened the last hinge on the chicken coop door just as the clouds broke open, slow drizzles darkening the soil and dappling the brim of his hat. Lena stood in the lean-to, arms crossed, watching the sky like she was reading it for signs. They'll be early this year, she said, nodding toward the north ridge. Storms. He looked over at her, wiping his hands on a rag. You read the weather better than I do. I used to listen to a farmhand back home. Said the birds go quiet when something bad's coming. Haven't heard a warbler all morning. Elijah followed her gaze toward the treeline. The hush was there now that she'd said it, not silence, exactly, but a stillness that pressed in. Henry was inside, napping after lunch, his small frame curled beneath the quilt Lena had stitched from scraps of old shirts and flour sacks. You trust your instincts, Elijah said, stepping under the shelter beside her. I have to. She pulled her shawl tighter. Every time I doubted myself, it cost me. The rain picked up, tapping steadily against the roof. Elijah leaned against the post beside her, the scent of wet pine rising between them. What would you do? She asked, voice barely raised above the wind. If someone came looking? He didn't answer right away. His jaw worked once. Depends on who they are. And if it's the man my father sold us to? Elijah looked at her, and the steadiness in his eyes made the tightness in her shoulders ease just a little. He won't get past me. She nodded once, then turned her face to the rain. I've never stayed in one place long enough to know what it feels like to be protected. You are now. They stood like that until the rain softened and the clouds began to part. Lena stepped out from the lean-to and crossed to the coop, checking the latches herself. Elijah watched her move, efficient, quiet, grounded in a way she hadn't been weeks ago. Later, she returned from the woods with a bundle of chokecherry branches and a small pouch of dried bark tucked into her apron. She laid them out on the table and took a small jar from the shelf. For Henry's cough if it comes back, she explained. Boil the bark with honey. The woman who worked the still room on the farm taught me before she passed. Elijah nodded, impressed. You've got more grit than most men I've known. Lena poured water into the kettle. I used to think being hard was the only way to survive. But it's not. It's knowing when to soften, too. He met her eyes. You've got both. That night, after Henry had eaten his fill and fallen asleep with a wooden bird tucked in his palm, Lena joined Elijah on the bench outside. The moon was nearly full, casting silver over the pasture. She held a cup of dandelion tea, the steam curling around her face. I used to dream about a place like this, she said, but I never thought I'd be allowed it. You don't need permission, Elijah said. You just need to choose it. She turned toward him. And if I choose you? His breath caught, but his voice stayed steady. Then I'd carry that with both hands. Lena set her cup down. You never asked me what I want. I figured when you were ready you'd tell me. She reached over and placed her hand on his. I want to plant roots. I want Henry to grow tall and safe. I want mornings that start with the wind in the trees and nights that end with you beside me. Elijah's hand closed around hers. Then that's what we'll have. She leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation. Their kiss was quiet, like the turning of a page, like something begun without fanfare but meant to last. When she pulled back, she rested her head on his shoulder. I don't feel like I'm running anymore. You're not, he said. You're home. By late July, the days stretched long and breathless, heat pooling in the corners of the cabin and drawing sap from the pine posts. The meadow grass stood waist-high in places, pale yellow at the tips, and Lena had taken to tying her hair up in a kerchief while she worked outside, her skin bronzing under the relentless sun. Elijah returned one evening with a saddlebag slung over his shoulder and dust caked in the creases of his shirt. Lena met him at the gate, wiping her hands on her apron. Supplies? She asked, glancing at the bag. And a few things from the post, he said. There was a letter addressed to me, from Fort Benton. She stilled. You expecting anything? No, he said, shifting the bag to his other shoulder. But it's from a friend of my brother's. Served with him in Arkansas. Seems he's passing through on his way east. Wants to stop by for a day. Lena folded her arms. Does he know about us? No, Elijah didn't hesitate. He doesn't know anything I wouldn't want shared. She looked past him, toward the cabin where Henry sat by the window, carving a sliver of wood with growing precision. I don't want strangers asking questions. He's not the kind to pry, and he won't stay long. Lena nodded slowly. Then he can come, but only if he leaves it all behind him when he does. Elijah reached for her hand. That's the only kind of company I keep anymore. The man arrived 2 days later, riding a tall roan gelding with a scar under its left eye and a limp that didn't seem to bother it much. He introduced himself as Isaac Lang. His beard was trimmed close, his hat clean but worn at the brim, and he carried himself with the quiet bearing of someone who'd seen too much and learned not to speak of it. You must be Lena, he said, dismounting with a nod. Elijah's letters were scarce, but your name came through. Lena raised a brow. I didn't think he wrote letters. Isaac chuckled. He didn't, but he started signing his name with something softer in his tone. I figured someone was behind that. Elijah stepped between them, brushing the dust from his gloves. He's a good man. But he talks too much. Lena narrowed her eyes. Then he stays one night. No more. Isaac inclined his head. Fair enough. The evening passed quietly. Isaac shared a tin of tobacco and a story about a wagon that lost its front wheel in a river crossing. Lena listened without comment, her eyes flicking toward Henry every so often, who stayed close to her leg until the fire burned low. After the boy fell asleep, Isaac leaned back in his chair and looked between them. You've got something good here. Elijah didn't answer. Isaac's gaze settled on Lena. I seen women cross half the country with nothing but a name and a child. Most don't find a place that holds them. Lena folded her hands in her lap. Most don't find someone willing to offer more than a bed. You found better, Isaac said. Don't let fear make you forget that. She didn't nod, but she didn't look away either. In the morning, Isaac saddled his horse and left without fuss. Elijah watched him go from the edge of the porch, his arms crossed over his chest. Lena stood beside him, her fingers brushing his sleeve. You trust him? She asked. I do. Then I will too. The next week, the sky split open with a storm that lasted 3 days. Rain beat against the roof like fists, and water pooled in the low spots out back. Lena baked bread with what flour remained, and Elijah patched a leak above the window with pine tar and scraps of canvas. One evening, as the wind howled outside and Henry slept with his head tucked beneath Elijah's old coat, Lena sat at the table threading a needle with a steady hand. I used to think storms meant something awful was coming, she said. Elijah leaned against the wall, arms loose at his sides. And now I think they just pass. He crossed the room and stood beside her. She set the needle down and looked up. I want to marry you, she said, her voice even. Elijah didn't move. You sure? I don't want to wait for the world to decide I'm allowed to be happy. His voice was low. Neither do I. She reached for his hand. Then let's decide for ourselves. He didn't kiss her. Not right then. He just held her hand, warm and firm, and nodded once. Outside, the rain slowed, and inside, something quiet and lasting took hold between them. August settled over the valley with a hush, the kind that made the ground feel thick with sleep and the trees lean into stillness. Cicadas sang at dusk, and the creek behind the pasture ran lower, slow and amber-colored in the sun. Lena stood at its edge one morning, skirts lifted above her ankles, watching little minnows dart between stones. Behind her, Elijah walked up with a small tin in his hand. Found something in the shed, he said. Wasn't sure what it was at first. She turned, and he held out a folded piece of oilcloth. Inside lay a silver brooch, tarnished at the edges, shaped like a swallow in flight. A single chip of turquoise still clung to one wing. Yours? She asked. My mother's, he said. She wore it on Sundays when we had them. Lena looked back at the water. You want me to have it? He nodded. If you'll wear it when we marry. She reached out and took it, her fingers brushing his. I'll wear it every day. They stood there a while, bare feet in the cool silt, the wind catching her hair and pulling it softly against his chest when she stepped near. Later that week, Lena and Elijah rode into town. Henry stayed behind, watched over by a widow from a neighboring homestead who sometimes brought eggs to trade. The ride was long, the sun high, and Lena wore Elijah's second-best hat to keep her face shaded. When they arrived, she hesitated outside the mercantile. Elijah noticed. You don't have to go in if you're not ready. I want to, she said. I just never walked into a place like this on my own terms. They stepped inside together. The storekeeper, a wiry man with spectacles and a crooked smile, looked up. Well, Mr. Hart. Been months. Who's this? This is Lena Sutton, Elijah said plainly. We're to be wed. The man touched the brim of his hat. Then she'll need a dress. Lena's eyes narrowed. I can stitch my own. The storekeeper chuckled. A woman after my wife's heart. Cloths in the back. You take what you need. They left with muslin, a tin of buttons, and a single length of lace Elijah insisted on buying. For the collar, he said, so it catches the light. That night, Lena sat by the hearth with the muslin spread across her lap, chalking lines with quiet focus. Elijah watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, the firelight soft against his face. "You making it white?" he asked. She shook her head. "Pale blue, like that first morning after the storm passed." He said nothing, but the look he gave her held something long and steady. The ceremony was small. Not a soul from town came by Lena's choice. Elijah spoke the words slow, his voice low and sure, and Lena's hand stayed in his the whole time. Henry stood between them, holding a crown of meadowgrass he'd woven himself. He placed it on her head when they finished. "I reckon that makes you family now," he said. Lena knelt, pulled him close. "We always were." They ate cornbread and smoked trout caught from the creek, and shared a jar of honey from a hive Elijah had found hidden in a dead cottonwood. As night settled, Elijah lit a lantern and hung it from the porch beam. Lena stepped into the circle of its light. "You never asked me if I was afraid. I figured you'd tell me," he said, walking to her. "I was. Not of you, of being seen too clearly." He took her face in his hands. "I see you, Lena, every piece. And I wouldn't change a single thread." She leaned into him, and they stood wrapped in each other's arms as the stars came out, slow and bright, one by one. They didn't leave the homestead after that. There was no need. The land held them steady. Lena's garden doubled in size, and she strung beans to dry along the porch eaves. Elijah built a smokehouse near the edge of the woods and taught Henry how to split kindling without nicking the blade. They never spoke of Kansas again. In winter, Lena gave birth to a daughter with Elijah's eyes and her mother's restless hands. They named her Ruth, after the woman who once taught Lena how to boil bark and stitch wounds without flinching. Henry grew tall, his shoulders broadening, his laugh louder now. He learned to trade pelts at the post and read by firelight. He never again had to run. One spring morning, years later, Elijah came in from the pasture to find Lena sitting at the table, her hair streaked with gray, her hands still nimble as she patched the knee of a pair of trousers. He set down his hat and leaned over to kiss her cheek. She looked up at him with a smile that hadn't changed in all the time he'd known her. "I still wear the brooch," she said. "I still see the girl who crossed the trees," he answered. And they stayed that way, weathered but never worn out. Two souls who had walked through fire and found not only shelter, but a place to bloom. Together, always.